Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelancer writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild NPC supplement, Ceazor's Soldiering, designed by Christopher Faught for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, consider using my affiliate links for your DM's Guild shopping and supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. Shoutouts to my platinum patrons, Andrew, Richard, Joe, Will, Tiny Dancer, Nick, Andy, Grayson, and Chris. And gold patrons, RPG Papercrafts, Charming Grenade, Pretty Boy, and Yuma, Marcos Dead, Vicente, Gilberto, Sean, A.K., Cert2B, Adam, Dead Lizard, Lounge, Sam, Arash, and Lumpy Spuds. Thank you all very much for your support. The Appendix B of the Monster Manual is probably one of the most used parts of the Monster Manual, even though we all love our monsters, we love fantasy creatures and big nasty things to fight. More often than not, players are going to run into just, NPC, humanoid people in combat-like professions. So guards and mages and bandits and pirates and cultists, very, very commonly used, especially almost wholly in Tier 1, which is a very, very common way to play D&D. So an NPC, for lack of a better term, monster manual that is solely focused on those kind of stat blocks could be a welcome addition. And I think that one that had a theme of low magic and low fantasy, so picture more like, Game of Thrones style, maybe knights and barbarians and stuff, could be a good theme to tie that together, which is where I think this should have gone. Instead, what this really is, it's a collection of about a little over a dozen NPCs that are very similar to the ones in Appendix B of the Monster Manual, which is the also over a dozen NPCs listed here. I don't really even see a good enough justification for this product's existence. And I do mean that as a harsh criticism. There's not really enough difference here, and I'll go through it with some examples. But I mean, between the Appendix B of the Monster Manual, which starts on page 342, you really have almost everything you need to then extrapolate and create more, slight tweaking. If you want to make a mage that's a slightly higher level or lower level, that's not really that hard to do. In fact, that product that told you how to take the existing ones and then modify them in different ways, that could be a useful product because we've got all this information here. Just trying to create slightly modified stat blocks on your own with kind of questionable balance doesn't really appeal to me, and I don't really see a reason that anybody would necessarily need to use these. Now, I do like the art. First of all, the layout is very much the traditional professional layout of stat blocks for 5e. I appreciate that. I do like the use of kind of classic medieval artwork here because I think that fits the theme of what the designer was going for, which was a more low magic, traditional medieval based hirelings. Basically, that was the impetus for creating this entire thing. And they mentioned in the extremely brief intro that they wanted to create a bunch of kind of low level NPC hirelings for their party, and I think this could work pretty well. But again, so could the actual, the guard and the knight, the spy, the scout, the noble. All of these stat blocks that are already in the Monster Manual could work just fine for that. The ones that I wanted to highlight. So let's look at the difference between. Let's see. This one adds a spearman, and I'm going to compare that with the tribal warrior from the Monster Manual, which is one of the very last stat blocks in the entire book. So the tribal warrior in the Monster Manual has an armor class of 12 and 11 hit points. The spearman here has an armor class of 12 and 11 hit points. The stats are probably average out to about 10. There's some 8s in there. There's some 13s. This one is, I guess, higher stats because there's no 8s. It's just 10s and a few 12s for strength and dex. The tribal warrior has pack tactics, which means they have advantage if one of their allies is within 5 feet, which is always pretty easy to track. The Spearman has Spears Unite. If an ally is within 5 feet of the NPC gains +2 to hit on melee attacks. I do not like that at all. One of the things I love about 5e is that it simplifies and streamlines a lot of those fiddly modifiers, all those +1s, +2s, +3, +5, all that stuff from previous editions of D&D and a lot of other RPGs that use modifiers for everything, and you have to keep track of what all your pluses and minuses are. D&D can streamline 90% of that and basically just says, look, you either have advantage or disadvantage if these things happen. I believe the only thing that actually uses a modifier is the cover system. Everything else is basically advantage or disadvantage. And the designer here kind of balks at that or doesn't quite use that because a lot of these things are like +2s to hit, and I do not like that at all. I don't think that works very well. I don't think that's in the right feeling of 5e D&D either. Another one, mounted shooting. And a mounted archer fires an arrow while moving on horseback at least 20 feet straight toward a target. They gain +2 damage, but a -1 to hit. No, I don't want to keep track of that at all. I don't like the modifiers. That's getting into what 5e is not all about. Spear carrier, they're trained to carry 2 spears. I am never going to keep track of ammunition in my game. Some people might, that's fine, but especially on NPC. You might have players track ammunition. I could definitely get that as kind of a money sink and maybe an interesting tactical choice. But NPCs, I'm never going to give 2 shits about how much ammo they carry, but maybe that's just me and not for everyone. But the point is, the Spearman and the Tribal Warrior are just not really different at all, and enough to make its to justify its own existence, and for some reason as a challenge value of 1/4, whereas the Tribal Warrior is a challenge value of 1/8, so they're worth different XP. So I'm not sure how the designer came to that conclusion and why we couldn't just retheme the Tribal Warrior as just anybody carrying a spear. You see what I'm saying? I don't see the need for this. Another example is the Knight versus the Sergeant. So I'm going to use the Knight stat block because I think this is the highest one that's used here. Yeah, CR3 Knight. So most of these are CR 1/4 to CR1, I believe. Yeah, so 1/4, half, and some ones. So very low level. The Sergeant is the highest one. So I found the most common facsimile in Appendix B is the Knight. So the Sergeant here has an AC of 16 and 60 hit points. 8d10 plus 16. I'm not sure why a Knight has a d10 of hit dice. I don't think humanoids are supposed to have a d10. I thought it was only larger creatures. The Knight has an AC of 18 and 52 hit points, so fairly similar. The Knight does have a higher armor class. The Knight also has higher saving throws in Con and Wiz, and has advantage on saving throws against being frightened, so a lot more defensive capabilities. The Sergeant doesn't have any of that. The Knight, let's go with the Sergeant first. The Sergeant has a multi-attack with a great weapon, so either an axe, hammer, or sword. They can make 2 attacks with a +5 to hit, 10 damage each. Exact same thing with the Knight. The Knight has 2 melee attacks, can either use a great sword, or you could, again, retheme that as whatever weapon you want, and does an average of 10 damage. The Knight also comes equipped with a heavy crossbow they could use, although they're a lot worse with that. They have the Knight has the leadership ability, recharges after a short or long rest. As an action, anybody within 30 feet essentially gains the Bless ability, gets a d4 to its attack, roll, or saving throw. This time with the Sergeant, once again, it uses a thing that I don't think should be used too much with 5e, gives them a +2 to their AC. Now you could, there are some spells that do that. I believe there's a Shield of Faith does a +2 to AC, so there is precedent for that in terms of giving the spell-like effect, but I'm not sure, again, why we need an entirely new stat block just to give it a rally as a reaction versus leadership as an action, and it has worse defenses than the Knight. So I don't know. I would have preferred, if this was the whole concept, to hey, let's expand the low-level stat blocks in the Appendix B of the Monster Manual and give players more options for hirelings, as well as giving some of the ones like Tribal Warrior, retheme them into something else. Although the Guard already exists, which is just Tribal Warrior wearing armor, basically. That could have been useful in terms of let's just take these existing stat blocks and show how we can change them and maybe swap weapons out and give them different abilities, or because they're different races, maybe they have these different abilities. I don't see this particular list of NPCs as being very useful for most people. We've already got pretty much all of these units, or close enough to these units, in the monster manual, and every DM ever would already own the monster manual that I would be aware of. I also think it's weird that, well, one thing I like the low magic concept, but I guess I was just doing that in my head. I was thinking, okay, what's the medieval artwork? It's a bunch of soldiers. I'm not even thinking D&D. I'm thinking medieval terms, and then they kind of throw in and the artwork too. It's more like historical based unit. So I'm getting that. It's mounted knights and crossbowmen and pikemen. Traditional military units from hundreds of years ago. And then we have things like the field cleric, which is just a low-level cleric with spell slots. I would have thought it'd be really cool if we went even further with the low magic theme, which again, I guess I was just thinking in my head, and created, okay, what would a healing unit look like that didn't have access to spells? Could they have, like, as an action, could they do like the lay on hands ability and just give hit points like once per day or something? Could they have the equivalent of patch somebody up as an emergency triage, and that would be like the spare the dying equivalent of that spell? So that would have been pretty interesting to see if you wanted to do a world or an area of your world that didn't have access to magic, or maybe they were specifically anti-magic, but they still had these kind of units to be able to do these things. And likewise, instead of a mage flinging spells, you would have somebody that could hurl like potions or contraptions or do something to gain those kind of similar effects. So that could have been interesting, instead of just creating a mage or a cleric that was one step lower level than the CR6 mage that's already in here, and the I think it's the acolyte is the CR2 CR1 quarter cleric that's provided in here. So I guess the field cleric is actually a slight upgrade from that, because it's got second level spell slots. So there are ways to make this a more useful, usable NPC supplement. And the way to do that is either you include those modifications as part of your product. You say, hey, here's how to expand everything, and here's some examples of how to do that. And on top of that, you could say, okay, here's a way to retheme some of these. So, for example, how to make a mage who doesn't actually use spells but has those similar kind of functions, or here's how to make a cleric who has those similar kind of functions in terms of healing. If you wanted to make a low magic world, which would fit this kind of more medieval theme, I think that would be something that I would like to see, versus just a bunch of stat blocks that frankly don't seem like they're that much different than what we already have. And there's bits and pieces in here that are not very well written. It's kind of awkward syntax, and maybe even a few grammatical errors. It's not too glaring because these are stat blocks, so it's not like I'm reading a lot of like prose or information or details. So I'm not getting lost in any kind of poorly written sentence structure. But the bits that I am reading, it just speaks to me as not being very well written. Maybe even English might not have been the first language of the designer here, which is fine. But if you're going to publish it in English, it needs to be well formatted, well edited, and flow properly. And I suspect that this was not the case here. To end on a more positive note, at least, it does include a D100 random encounter table, which is nice. It's unfortunately another issue of kind of it's not terribly written. It's just very basically written, I guess. It's just very well, for example, number 8, you are drawn to the sound of hoofs. You come upon a riding posse of mounted crossbowmen. When asked, they tell you they are tracking a band of orcs. These are very just simple sentences that aren't very exciting to read or look at. And as you can see, just without even me reading these, you can kind of glance down and see that most of them start with "you come upon." You come upon a party of 3 swordsmen. You come upon a party of 2 archers and 2 swordsmen. You come upon a party of 3 swords. You come upon us. You come upon. You come upon. That is not an exciting way to start an encounter at all. I think the better way to do this would have been to slash this in half or even a third of it, and create some more interesting scenarios, fewer of them, but include ones that are maybe more interesting. And there are some decent ideas here, that you come upon a bunch of I'm doing they come upon. You hear the sound of battle in the distance, and you find a group of what's the example here? 6 spearmen and an archer engaged in combat with a manticore. That's a cool encounter. It's especially when it's forces against forces. And what's interesting is that none of these are designed to be hostile fights. So they're all designed to be allies that you can find. So the random encounters is usually these units fighting another monster. So over half of them are just, you find one that's wrapped up in a giant snake, or you find them fighting a dragon or whatever else. Sometimes they're kind of nice. They're flipping a coin in the air and shooting, or they're roasting. They're on a campfire roasting a dead cockatrice or something. Those are flavorful and fun. So I think those are cool. There's one of them. There's a giant toad, and you just see the legs sticking out. Those are fun. I like those. But there's a quantity over quality aspect here that I didn't care for. I like that it's included here, and you can see it, the designer even ran out of ideas. It was just you come upon one person doing a thing. Like, just don't do a D100 table if you can't actually finish the D100 table. You don't have to make a full 100 list. You can have a list of 50 things, 40 things, 60 things. Doesn't really matter. You don't have to do a D100. There are some fun ones in here, but there's probably out of the 100, there's probably 20 of them that are quality. But I like that it's included here, so that's pretty nice. And that's really it. This is going to be a very short review because that's really all that's included. It's a little bit over a dozen stat blocks, a few tables at the end, and I wasn't terribly impressed with either one of those things. Let's go over my pros and cons for Ceazor's Soldiering. Pros, I do like the artwork. The classic medieval artwork does fit the theme pretty well. And I like that we get artwork included with every single unit on every single page. That makes it look very, very nice. And pro, I did include the D100 table of random encounters in my pros list because I like that it was here, even if it is too long. There's too much to where the author clearly ran out of ideas. But there are enough good things here that I'm including it on my pro. Cons, slight modifications of standard low CR NPC stat blocks. There's just not enough. None of these units differentiate themselves enough from what is already included. The closest are maybe mounted units that have some extra abilities, but I found their extra abilities too fiddly. And to go with the other con, questionable balance. I'm just not sure what the thought process was for creating the CRs to match these stats. None of them have less than a 10. And balance is always the most difficult thing for me to comment on when I'm reviewing it, because obviously I'm not testing these things in the wild. I'm just reviewing it based on what I'm reading. So I usually don't comment on balance too much, other than I might give my thoughts on it, but I wouldn't put it in a pro and a con. But this one I really have to put in my con because it just doesn't seem like it makes much sense based on how I can compare it directly to the monster manual, at least with the CR value. And the other con is I just don't think it's very well written. Any of the parts where it actually has multiple sentences, it's very basic sentence structure, and there might even be some grammatical errors in there, and some typo. Like, it just doesn't really seem to be very well written on top of everything else. Final verdict, Ceazor's Soldiering doesn't provide new or interesting NPCs to separate itself from Appendix B of the 5e Monster Manual. Thank you to everyone for watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson. And you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.